Welcome everyone to the first Biml Office Hours. We're planning on doing this as a uh, a semi-monthly. So bi-monthly would be once every 2 months. So we're going to do this as a semi-monthly thing, twice a month, and we'll see how people react to that. If we need to do it more often, we'll do it more often. If folks think that semi-monthly is too often, we can back off of that too, but we're going to start with semi-monthly and go from there. We're also going to be moving the times around a bit. So this one is at 2 p.m. Eastern, so it works pretty well for the entire United States, and it's a bit on the late side for most of Western Europe, and probably way too late or too early, depending on your perspective, for example, for Australia. So we're going to try some different times. The next one will probably be right around 7 p.m. Eastern U.S. time. So we'll try and kind of alternate so that everybody can have a chance at least once a month to get to a Biml Office Hours. We are still we're going to be experimenting with the format a little bit. We want to make this as useful as possible for everybody. So I'm going to try out a couple of things today, and if you give me feedback over the course of the hour here or afterwards, which things maybe worked well, which things didn't work well, which things we should think about adding. Very interested and open to hearing all of that feedback. So where I'd like to start is just by each of these office hours just showing you something that's kind of pre-release. I know that once you tell people something, it is completely out in the open, so feel free to tweet this or blog about it or do whatever you want to, even though it is a bit on the early side. But what I will start with is showing you something that is just finishing up now, and this is a BimlStudio feature presently. Now, in these office hours, I'm completely open to talking about anything in the free products or in the paid products, either way. And if you aren't interested in the paid products, you can just plug your ears for the pieces that you don't want to hear about. So I'm going to go ahead and show you just one thing that is being finished up right now, and you can maybe guess from what I'm about to write what the topic is. So I'm going to create a new project called ADF. I wonder what that stands for. What we have added now in the Biml language is support for creating Azure Data Factories. So we're looking at maybe doing a last sort of modification to this in terms of exactly what level below the root node Data Factory assets live. But you can see we have full fidelity with everything that you can do in Azure Data Factory currently. So let's say I wanted to create a Azure Storage connection. So I can just go ahead and say Azure Storage Link Service. I can give it the name of, my link service, connection string. I need to, of course, put in a connection string for blob storage, which it would have like storage account name and other stuff in there. And in our visual designers, we'll have support for helping you write the storage connection strings. We already have that for the other connection string types. And then on top of this, I can also do, for example, an Azure Blob dataset, and then that will have its own name. I'll just call this my SRC dataset, and then I can go in and reference the link service by name. I called this one my LS, and then I can fill out everything else that you would expect. For a blob dataset, I'm going to have a file name and a folder path. Some of those are going to be required. I can go ahead and put in different format options, availability options, partition by options, structure information. So I have to put in, of course, all the necessary items. Let's say I want to have this creating a new data slice each hour. And then just jumping ahead one more piece. This is actually not going to be completely filled out because I didn't put in any structure information. But if I go down here and add in one more piece, I can create a pipeline. And then that pipeline can have and I'm not doing great naming here, but in description I'll just fill in with nonsense. Start, end, pipeline mode, let's say this is scheduled, and then I can go in and put in all the additional information that I might want to have, activities. So for example, if I wanted to have a copy activity, and description is required in Azure Data Factory, which is why I'm just putting in nonsense stuff for you to see now. I could now say inputs, say input is equal to that data set that we just created, my SRCDS. And then I can set other options in here as well. For example, what my source and destination parameters might happen to be. I'm just going to show you the basic high-level stuff so you can see roughly how these are structured. And then I would create another data set here, most likely to something else. For example, Azure SQL Database, Azure SQL Data Warehouse, etc. This is all I think, going to be very interesting for folks who are doing cloud migration scenarios. I'm not sure how many folks have worked with Azure Data Factory already in some of your existing solutions. It is not a replacement for SSIS. There may have been some aspirations at one point or another for it to be that, but at least as it stands now, and as I would guess it will progress over the next couple of years, it's not going to have any of the very rich built-in data transformation capabilities that exists in a platform like SSIS. You can think of this being more like a SQL agent sort of replacement in the cloud, or a SQL agent analog, where you can see like the types of activities you can have here, copy activities, being able to run some custom .NET code, which would get you the closest to real data transformation in the sense we think of it in an SSIS sort of landscape. Hadoop streaming, being able to run Hive and Pig jobs, being able to run MapReduce code, being able to run machine learning batches, and being able to run SQL Server stored procs. So these are the activities that are currently available in Azure Data Factory, and that's not the richness that you would expect with an SSIS replacement. So if you're worried about having to go, hey, do I have to go learn an entirely new thing? Is Biml doing this, means that this has hit some critical mass, and now I need to go and relearn everything I know in SSIS in Azure Data Factory? I think the answer there is no. If you are looking at cloud integration scenarios, particularly around Hadoop, and particularly around many different on-premises sites, and bringing those together into a central cloud store, or even a central on-premises store, or you're looking at things like doing partial or complete cloud migrations. Those are the places where Azure Data Factory is going to be really valuable, and where some of this new functionality, I think, is going to be helpful in scripting that out. You can hook this up, because this is just Biml code now, to the same metadata stores that you are using for your other code generation, and we are actually implementing this inside of our in-house built framework, BimlFlex, as well. So you'll be able to flip a switch and say, I want this whole workload to run in ELT mode on Azure Data Warehouse, and this will just take your on-prem data sources, automatically generate the code to ship them up into the cloud using ADF and some other stuff, and then run your workloads there. So you guys can all certainly do the same things there. So we got a comment here from David. Cool, this already looks better than the UI and the JSON stuff that you have to write for ADF anyway. Thank you. That's a nice compliment. And we do intend to make this a little bit better too. In the first release of this, we're not sure yet exactly, because we want to get this out quickly. We're not sure exactly how much visual support we're going to have, if it's going to be really high-end stuff. But our goal is to have our, if you folks have worked with the ADF editors at all, basically you have this thing where I can say, I want to create a new data set, or I want to create a new pipeline, and it'll just give you a JSON editor, and then you have to go ahead and code in the JSON, which is okay, and then you hit deploy, and they'll give you a visualization of what's happening there, but it's not, you don't really have a visual editing, an interactive visual editing experience that that we're going to be building over time for this also. So it may be the case that if you're doing a lot of ADF work, that you just like using the tools just because we're able to do a little bit more around the visual editors, or because you like the XML better, or because you just want to keep everything in Biml. So yeah, hopefully this is useful for folks. So what happens with ADF when it's built? So when we build, we go and spit out the JSON files, and at that point, those JSON files can be deployed using the PowerShell commandlets that are made available by the ADF team. So they have a commandlet library where you can just say, hey, here's my JSON, go ahead and deploy this up for me. Or you could, if you wanted to do a more manual process, bring those files into portal.azure.com and manage those yourself, but the commandlet is going to be the probably most commonly used deployment and management experience there, or the commandlets, I should say. We will also be doing a deploy feature where under build and deploy, over time from within this tool at least, you'll be able to have more deployment options directly from here without having to use other deployment tools, and basically that'll just be using the same PowerShell commandlets that you would be putting in your own build scripts. It's just that we'll have a button that essentially does it for you. And we will be using the commandlets, so you will have to have those installed if you want to use our deployment features. From our conversations with some of the folks at Microsoft, that is going to be the best way to make sure that you don't end up with a deployment feature that breaks at some point in the future due to a breaking change that they had to take on some of the APIs or interfaces. So we're going to stick with the commandlets for our deployment features and just build essentially a visual wrapper on top of that. Any other questions about that? Great. Well, hopefully when the next preview build of this BimlStudio goes up, anybody who's tracking that, you'll see all the Azure Data Factory stuff in the next preview build. So that should be exciting for folks at least who are thinking about Azure Data Factory. Let's, now that I've covered the here's an interesting thing part of the office hours, let's open it up to questions. I'll let you guys go ahead and just start popping questions into the questions window if there's anything you'd like me to cover. In the meantime, Jim Miller sent me a question ahead of time and asked if I could handle it, and I think it's a great question, and I didn't do too much preparation around it because I didn't want to, you know, I think part of the idea here is to make this more of an interactive sort of thing where both if I have to spend a whole bunch of time beforehand, it's kind of not office hours anymore, and also so that you guys can, to some extent, see how the sausage gets made. So I'm going to create a new project here, and we're going to cover Jim's question. So basically, he has noted something that I've heard some confusion and some issues around in the past, which is why can't I get project parameters to work really easily in BimlExpress or BitsHelper, but usually if I were to try Mist or BimlStudio, BimlStudio, by the way, is just the new name for Mist. If I were to use one of those, it just all works perfectly. So as it turns out, there is an article that, I don't know what the right way to say it is, Catherine, that I guess Catherine and I co-authored. Basically what happened was Catherine said, hey, how come you guys don't do project parameters in BimlExpress and BitsHelper? It seems like you should be able to do a fairly easy job of that. I said, oh, there are good reasons for it. And she said, well, tell me what the good reasons are. And I said, how about I just write it up for you? So I wrote it up, and then she said, well, let's turn it into a blog post because I am not great about doing blog posts. So here is this post. It's from late last month. And we go through all the reasons why when you do a build, you just don't get auto project parameters inside of your project. The fundamental reason is that project parameter files are designed in such a way so as you have all of the parameters in one file, both manually created ones and potentially auto-generated ones, and it is very difficult to tell the difference between the two, especially in maintenance scenarios. So for the first build, everything would be awesome, but if you went and now tried to change your parameter names, for example, your project parameter names, now you can't really tell if the old ones are actually orphaned and should be deleted, or if they were manually created ones or other things. So this article does a pretty good job, I think, of kind of talking through the whole reasoning process. And then at the end it says, hey, wait a second, there is a possible thing that we could do here. Is it actually worth it? And as far as I know, we've gotten just one comment from Sean about it. If others want to read this and talk about, you know, whether or not it makes sense for us to do more around project parameters, absolutely open to that. Hopefully for folks who have interacted with me or other folks from Verigence, they know that we don't like turn stuff off just in BitsHelper or now in BimlExpress just because, you know, we're trying to get you to buy something. We normally don't include stuff either because there's some bright line, an entirely new feature area that's in paid product, or because there's actually a good technical reason for it. So here's one where there's actually a good technical reason for it, and if someone has ideas, we're totally open to looking into that and doing it a better way. So what I'm going to do, though, is show you, with the current state of affairs, how you go about doing this. So I'm going to call this test Project.params. And the only thing that I've done is taken a code sample that that Jim provided to say, hey, here's a repro for the issue that I'm seeing. So I just created a new project. I've got BimlExpress installed. And what I'm going to do now is just add in the Biml file that he sent me already. So I'm going to go here to add and then existing item. And here we have this one Biml file 1 that he's already created. So if I take a look at this, inside Biml file 1, it's relatively straightforward, right? So we've got a couple of connections that are that have expressions that are using these project parameters. So we've got a package project that gets defined. It can be called anything. And we, at the project level, are saying we've got these 2 project connections. We're defining these 6 project parameters. And then those project parameters are being used in a couple of different places, most notably here to override our connection information. But I believe they're also used, they could be used elsewhere, but really here's where they're being used in this particular sample, just to go ahead and change where our connection strings look like. So if I were to go and build this, if I've got all the requisite databases set up, which I do because he sent me a nice little database create script for creating the tables that he reads from in this data flow, I can just go ahead and right-click and say generate packages. And what we'll see happens here is it actually does create those packages. But the confusing part is once the packages create apparently successfully, if I try and open them, I'm going to see a bunch of errors. So let's take a look at what happened. Oh, sorry. I did this earlier and then actually re-imported it, so I need to just change that connection string. Sorry about that. And there we go. So I just have that in a different database than he had in the sample. Okay, so it created my packages, but if I open one of these, what happens is I get all kinds of errors, and I look at the error list, and it's like some variant of project ETL DM server was not found in the variables collection, right? So what do I do in order to make this work? Because most people would look at this and say, well, wait a second, I did everything in the Biml I was supposed to do. Why didn't it just work? Well, the answer is because we don't have any project parameters defined. So the BimlExpress and BIDS Helper Biml engines do not actually put anything into the params file. Now I'm going to show you a workaround for this, where if you're a Biml purist, then and you're totally fine with just wiping out that params file every single time, where you can actually do it right now. And Catherine, I probably should have put that in that blog post, but I honestly didn't even think of it until earlier today. But if you want to find out why we're not injecting any code into the params file, go ahead and look at this blog post. It's got all the information. So here's what you can do to solve this problem. If you're fine with doing a little bit of manual work, you can basically just solve your problem in about 2 minutes, which I'll do this right here. So I'm just going to go into my params file. I had 6 parameters, so I'm going to create 6 of these guys, and then I just do a little bit of tabbing. So I go back and forth. And this really isn't the end of the world, because in most cases, your design patterns, even with automation, aren't going to have just this tremendous number of project parameters, because then that creates a management issue downstream, right? If I'm creating hundreds of project parameters, well, the whole point of having the parameters is that at some point somebody's going to set those, right? So if I've got hundreds of the things, I'm probably just got a bad architecture or a bad pattern, because I'm now passing a maintenance problem down to my ops team, is essentially what's happening there. Not universally true, but I think in most cases, if you're creating a huge number of these, you probably ought to think about whether or not you've got the right pattern. And let me just make sure I've got there we go. So I've got strings, and then just to make sure that this runs, I'm going to go and do the same thing again with these values, and I'm going to be done here in 30 seconds. So it's definitely the case that this was inconvenient and not something that you really want to do with automation technology, but this is, as a one-time thing, it's probably okay for most folks, which is the reason why we kind of settled on the pattern that we did. So now that I've got those done, I don't even need to regenerate, right? What I've already built, I can actually just open it now, and now there aren't going to be any errors because those project parameters now exist. So I have, just to be clear, going back over the steps, I had to do this in Biml. I had to define the parameters in my Biml code so that, for example, when I use those parameters in some of my SSIS expressions, it can actually go and find them, right? So I did have to have them in the Biml code, but I additionally, and this is the redundancy part, I additionally had to define them in the params file. And that's the way things are today. So let's think for a moment about what other options I might have. Because maybe, there are really good reasons why I do need to have 100 of these parameters. Or maybe there are really good reasons why, like maybe I'm doing a whole bunch of different code gens for different customers or different audiences, and I need to have different tweaks to these parameters, and having to manage those tweaks manually defeats the purpose of having it automated in the first place, right? So there are reasons why you can imagine you would really just want to have your project parameters auto-generated as well, and where all of the issues that are brought up in the blog post around, well, what if there's a mix between manually generated and non-manually generated, you can just say, I don't care, because it's always automatically generated no matter what, full stop, do not pass go, right? So let's see how we could go ahead and implement that even with the tool set as it stands right now. So I'm going to go ahead and add in a second Biml file. And this one is going to be called params pattern. Now here's a fun thing about Biml files that a lot of people, especially as they're first getting started, don't always realize. Biml files don't actually have to generate Biml code. As it turns out, you can have them generate any text you want to. You can have them generate a simple T-SQL script, and then you can have that spit out to a T-SQL file and reference that file. There's a whole bunch of different ways you can handle that. So what I'm going to do here is actually something kind of fun. This Project.params file is actually just an XML file. So I'm going to hit view code on it, and that's what my params actually look like. Right? So watch what I'm going to do here. I'm just going to copy what I have, and I'm going to put it into this new params pattern Biml file that I just created a moment ago. Now I don't actually need all 6 of these. I want these to be auto-generated. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and cut these out just like that. And I'm just going to have that one parameter in there. Okay? And now the next thing I'm going to do is start writing some Biml code. So this might be a little freaky, but yeah, absolutely, you can do Biml code inside of one of these. And moreover, you can do Biml code with like call Biml script capabilities. There's a lot of different stuff that you can do there. What I'm going to do is put this in a is just do the following. I'm going to say for my parameters, I'm going to say for each var proj.param in, and then I'm going to say root node dot projects dot first. And let me actually just grab this out. And you would probably make this code a little bit more robust if you had like a multi-project environment or something like that. But basically all I'm doing here is saying var package project. I'm just grabbing that project file that I already created. Because the whole idea here is to make this automated. So what I want to do is jump into this project file that already has my parameters defined. And I am going to iterate over the parameters that I defined in there. And I'm actually going to automatically, I'm going to generate my params file. And then I'm going to overwrite the params file. All right, so you see where I'm going with that? Let's see how this works in practice. So I'm going to say package project dot parameters. And then for each one of these, I'm going to create one of these guys. Okay? And now the next thing I'm going to do is say, well, what should it be called? It should be called proj.param.name. What should the ID be? Well, in this case, we've got a variety of solutions we could use, but I'm just going to say give it a new GUID. Bracket pound equals system.guid.new GUID. I believe that is the syntax we use there. And then what else do I have here? I can leave those all alone. What's my value going to be? Well, it's going to be bracket pound equals proj.param dot value. And what's my data type going to be? Now, the data type, you have to have the type codes. You could do a simple little lookup table for that. But we know that all of ours are going to be strings, and strings are 18. So I'm just going to take a quick shortcut and just leave that as 18. Now that I have this, we're actually in a pretty good place, right? So as of right now, if I were to execute this Biml script somehow, it would actually create for me a parameters file that had all the parameters that I needed. So it looks like we're kind of in good shape. But how do I get this to write to the params file? So that is where you use something that is, it might seem like a hack, but it's actually kind of clean. So if I go here and right-click, and I'm going to add in one more Biml file, and I'm going to call this params writer. And here's a fun one. So if I go in here, I'm going to leave the Biml in here just so I don't get any syntax errors saying, hey, you don't have a root node or anything like that, right? So this is just going to be an empty Biml file, and the only thing that's actually going to live in here is code. So watch what I can do. System.io.file.write all text, and this is just a .NET API. And then what I can do is, and there are various ways to get this automatically, but just for now, I'm going to do a quick and dirty sort of thing, just so I can complete the loop on this and show you. I want to write it to that file. And what are the contents? Well, we all know about call BimlScript, right? So I'm going to call BimlScript on my params pattern. Just like that. And now that I've done that, I just need one more little piece of information. And interesting, did that already run? That shouldn't have run. Oh, I may have done a copy and paste that. I may have cut it instead of, yeah, I cut it out by mistake. Oops, there we go. I hit cut instead of paste. That's why it said it had been modified. So now if I go into my parameters, there's one more thing that I need to do. I want this to run at the end, right? So I am just going to say template tier. Oh, I see what's happening here. This is, I actually told you I was going to do this live. I didn't notice that this issue was actually happening just yet. It is actually previewing that code. I'll have to look into why it's doing that. But I'm going to put this in a high-level tier, like 999999. And then what I'm going to do is take this file right here and just do a, let's save all, yes, and let's close this. That all looks correct. So now what I'm going to do is just actually run params and params writer. And it says call BimlScript can't find the params writer. Let me go ahead back into there really quickly and fix that up. I think this is just params pattern.biml. And I don't need the backslashes because I put the @ sign in front of that. So you see the @ sign, that means it's a literal, so backslash is ignored for escaping, and the only thing you have to escape are quotes in that case. I was missing the .biml, so let's go ahead and run that again, and we're going to generate, and params pattern.biml. Let me try that one more time, and I'm going to do this just by putting in the full thing. Just, oh, I said bim. Darn it. There we go. And I think I spelled one more thing wrong, which is going to be this one. Is that really? And that thing that keeps on popping up is because it's we'll look into why it's doing that. I think it's actually just running that code in the background thread as part of the IntelliSense, which it shouldn't have to. But there we go. So now I've got my overwrites. I hit commit, and take a look. That project.params, which was previously empty, actually went ahead and got executed. So that works. So I could, just to kind of prove that there's no smoke and mirrors here, in case you guys don't trust me, and I always assume that people don't trust me, I'm going to put a 1 at the end of those. And now if we go and run this again, one at the end of all of them. So I'll go ahead and put this up on some sort of reasonable place. I think we'll put these on BimlScript.com. I would like to, in addition to BimlScript.com, for things that are formatted up as samples, I would like to have something more along the lines of a GitHub repository for things that we think are going to be very reusable, so that other people can make some modifications or improvements and do pull requests and stuff like that. We've started that with the Biml Heroes. We've recently created a GitHub repository where we're going to well, at least Verigence is going to be putting some more sort of toolbox code up there over time, and we certainly hope the Biml Heroes will also be making contributions. But if that's something that everyone else in the community is interested in, is in terms of having as a resource, you know, from my perspective, the more code that's out there, the better and the easier it is for everyone, right? So just checking the questions that we have here. Catherine can update the blog post, so it looks like it'll at least be going up there as well. Do I have any suggestions about connection strings for project connections using SQL Server authentication, not for Windows off? I always seem to have to edit the code behind to create the connection after it's created. Yeah, so I assume Ian is using some of the encryption options. There were a couple of the encryption options that were buggy in earlier versions. We should have those all sorted out at this point, in the next builds that you get of BimlExpress or BimlStudio is going to have those fixes included. As you can imagine, there's a fair bit of, even with Microsoft's assistance, there's a fair bit of reverse engineering that has to happen in order to figure out exactly how, you know, how do they set their IVs and their keys and all that stuff on the various encryption bits that they use. And just because a lot of those encryption features were written at many different points in time by multiple people, they also use kind of different standards in terms of how they do escaping and padding rather. And if you get any of those things wrong, the whole thing just blows up for that particular scenario, at least. So there were a couple of corners that we were missing depending on the type of encryption mode that you were using, but we do have those all, I believe, sorted out at this point, thanks to multiple folks in the community who gave us some really great repro cases for some of those corners. As it stands now, and in general, it's still not actually a good idea to use those encryption options, in my personal opinion and in the opinion of many others. Your best option is actually to say don't save sensitive on anything that is, you know, put that at the package and the project level. You don't want to be saving sensitive information, even with encryption, because the encryption has issues, right? If you're encrypting it with a password, now you've got a management problem that you've created where who has the password and what if the password changes, and that password very often ends up getting stored in clear text, whether you like it or not, in which case, what's the whole point of having password protected it anyway? Like, you ever have the situation where somebody in your organization says, oh, I can't get into this package, what's the password? And then you put it in Slack to them, or put it in you know, Link or Skype to them or something like that. That doesn't, I mean, that's better than like writing it on a whiteboard, which I've also seen happen, but it's kind of an issue. So the approach that I always recommend people use is, if you're using package deployment model, create a package configuration and drive all your sensitive information from a single package configuration file that can be configured on a per environment basis, and then you can lock down that package configuration file for that environment, either in your source control system or on file system share or whatever you use for protecting files in your own environment. The option, if you're using project deployment, you can either do one of two things. You can actually still use package configurations in project deployment, though it's not something Microsoft is thrilled about, so we wouldn't strongly recommend that. But if you're trying to take something from package deployment into project deployment and do it really quickly, for example, you could still have package deployment, package configs rather, your DTS config files for some of that sensitive information. But if you're in project deployment model, obviously the better solution is to do exactly what we were just doing around project parameters. Go ahead and put in your password and username information as project parameters, so just like you're seeing here, except you'd also have a username and password, and then that can be configured directly into the connection manager, and then you can configure that when you run it on the project deployment, and you can even go ahead and hook up controlled environments and everything else, and you know, your folks in ops will know exactly what to do with that, or if you don't have an ops person, there are a couple of tutorial articles on it. And then of course the only question becomes, do you parameterize the individual pieces, or do you go ahead and just parameterize the whole connection string? And then one other thing to keep in mind, if you're just doing standard connection managers, they actually will automatically create for you implicit project parameters that aren't defined in here for each of your project connection managers that has database, server, username, password. So you don't even have to manually create them in most cases. You can just go ahead and from your SSIS DB, which I can actually just show you very briefly here, if I have something in here in my SSIS DB, where is it? Integration Services Catalog. And then here, if I jump in here, I can say, hey, I want to go ahead and create an environment for this. And if I look inside the environment and go and look at my, am I in the right place here? I'm not usually the one who does this, so it's somewhere in here. Someone who's more, probably Andy could tell you about this because he's an expert on the package catalog. You can go in and actually just say, probably this one doesn't have any connections. That's the reason why I didn't see it. So if I have one that has some connections in it, I will automatically have in my environment configuration pre-configured parameters where I can go in and say, here's my username, here's my password. So that's by far of using Project Config. That's the way to do it. Don't put your passwords in your local dev files, whether they're Biml files or DTSX files or whatever, even if you have some level of encryption on them, because that will either end up being a headache or end up being a problem, in my considered opinion. So do I need to open all packages, or can I simply deploy after adding the parameters? If you add the parameters, you can just go ahead and deploy. You don't even need to open them. That validation is something that was taking place on design time. So when you execute, that same validation takes place. In fact, if I execute it and it failed, and then I add it to the params file and then execute it again, it would work. Question, which method do I prefer for creating the project parameters? The one you just showed or something similar to Catherine's solution, and why? Probably a deeper conversation. I'd have to refresh my memory on Catherine's solution. I, generally speaking, don't have really strong like prescriptive opinions for people except about like security stuff. So when it comes to this, I know it's not a super satisfying answer, but usually my answer is which one works better for this particular scenario that you happen to be tackling, which there are going to be pros and cons to almost any solution. I mean, we know we hear that a lot, like it depends. And sometimes you say, well, it really doesn't depend because this one solution is great and this other solution is complete trash, so there's no particular reason to consider the bad one. But Catherine's solution isn't bad, so I think it's just a trade-off sort of thing. If we have, and actually let me go ahead and bring up her article just so you guys can see it. It comes from 1125. Here is the solution where we, hold on a second, where this one is, the trade-off here I think would be, as of right now, the one that I showed is a little weird in that the code is kind of running in the background and you're seeing updates when you don't want to. We'll fix that bug. So after that bug is done, if you're really just looking for a complete blow it away and start over, you're looking for the full automation solution, the one that I just put up there is probably a little more convenient. You get to put in the parameters once. There's no hard coding of any kind, and it basically just, especially after you fix those paths, which the sample I give you will have the paths all be relative. Yeah, it's look at both and decide which one you want to do. It's probably the best answer there. Martin says the option they use is to save the passwords in TFS, closed environment for developers, and in KeePass. Yep, absolutely. Just don't put them in Biml files and don't put them in really encrypting them in package. Just is you're eventually going to get bit by that. All right. Any other questions from folks? So got about 20 minutes left, so I got time to dig into something else interesting. Oh, really? I hear all the time from folks. They got all kinds of questions about Biml and problems they're trying to solve. Maybe someone's just typing. All right. Thank you, Martin. So, Martin, I have a confession to make. Martin is a little bit of a plant. I said to Martin earlier, hey, if people are shy about asking questions, here are two that you could ask. So I'm going to pick GUID for now, since it's a more generally applicable one, I think, to for a lot of folks, and it shows a couple of different techniques, and also because it's not BimlStudio specific, we can talk more about metadata in the next one. Also, metadata might take a little more than 20 minutes, and I know I can completely nail GUID in that amount of time. For this one, just because I did this, I went ahead and published a little tool belt thing for some of the Biml heroes just recently. So I have it open in BimlStudio already. So I'm just going to show this one in BimlStudio, and we can go ahead and port it over to BimlExpress rather, even though that's not it's really not going to be much porting to do. But you'll kind of see how this works, and it's pretty clean. So, question I've gotten several times from folks is, well, I can't convince my organization that the Biml code ought to be kind of like the master, right? And as a result of that, or for other reasons, we're also source controlling our generated DTSX files. And for various reasons, it's a bad thing for our organization when every time I regenerate it, even if nothing has changed in the Biml files, to see all those DTSX files change. And usually the only change, if you're just regenerating from the same metadata and from the same Biml file, will be the GUIDs. So all those little GUIDs that you see scattered throughout your DTSX file on your tasks, you're going to see those all got modified. So what to do? How do you stop those from getting modified? Now, and part of the reason you care about that is maybe because you're getting a change log that shows like 300 packages changed when actually you only changed one, right? Or you changed the template to special case something, so only a handful of them changed, but you're getting now a change log that shows that all 300 changed. So you'd like to avoid that. The second thing is, that sometimes comes up is that people might use post-processing or third-party tools which rely on the GUIDs. And I know there are a handful of those out there. It's not probably the most robust approach to managing in those tools, but it's what they use, so we would like to work with them. So the question then becomes, how can I go about creating a solution where I am going to have all of my GUIDs be the same if nothing changes in the package? Okay, so what we did there is created this very simple GUID manager class. And this is just straight C# code, but it's not much of it. It's about 95 lines of code, 96 lines of code. And this is written to be very much production ready, right? So if this were quick and dirty code, it would probably be about 20 lines. But we wanted to make sure that all the null checking was that you could run this with confidence and not worry about things bombing out. So let's take a quick look at what this code is doing. So we wanted to make it really easy to consume, really easy to use. So it's just a static class. There's no state associated with it. You just make static method calls, and you'll see how that works in just a second. So it's called public static class GUID manager. And there are a couple of options that you can set here as fields. So we have an option, do we want to automatically load and store the GUIDs, or do I want to have to make manual calls? And you'll see how that works in just a second. There's a file path, where do I want to store my GUIDs? Because what we're going to do is we're going to cache all of the GUIDs that we assign to each of our tasks in all of our packages, and we're going to write those out to a file. And then when we do our next build, we're going to check to see if that file exists, and if it does, we're going to pull the GUIDs that we've calculated for the previous build and use those in the new one, so that way our GUIDs never change from build to build, at least for things that were already previously existed. If you go and change the name of everything inside the entire package, or you make some other substantial change, we can't tell, what that, at least not with this solution, we can't tell what that mapping ought to be, so we'll create new GUIDs for you. But as long as the names stay the same, you're all good. And by the way, that's the same thing with SSIS. Well, I guess you could change the names and the GUIDs wouldn't change, but if you make substantial changes to your package, you're going to see new GUIDs getting created. So it's not going to be too different from what you're getting in SSIS. So now if I go through, I'm going to say, all right, the way I'd like to interact with this is just to make a single call, say get ID, and pass it a node and have it spit out an ID for me. Either if this is the first time we're seeing this particular node with this particular name, give me a new GUID. If it's one that we've seen before, give me the one that we used last time. So we say get ID, we can pass in a name node. We do a null check here, and if it's null, we give you an exception right away saying, sorry, we need to have an actual object. If not, we pass the scope name. Remember in Biml, the scope name is the fully qualified name that has, let's say I have a task that's 15 levels deep, package1.container1.containera.container, 2. etc. all the way down, right? So scope name will include all those different levels. So it's a unique name within the system per type. So I'm going to go ahead and say scope name, And then I'm going to do get ID on scope name, which is just another overload that we have. If you had just the scope name, you could just pass that in rather than having to pass in a name node. And then it'll say, all right, first thing is, did you configure me, as is the default, to automatically load and store my GUIDs? And have I not yet loaded them? If so, go ahead and call load GUIDs. And what load GUIDs does is it says, all right, let me check and see if I have a GUID file path. All right, I do. Now let me go and find that GUID file path. I'm going to read the file, read all the text in the file. Right? Each line has its own key value pair, essentially, scope name to GUID. And then for each one of those, I'm going to split it on whatever the GUID file separator is, which we're using a pipe, but it's configurable just by setting this. You can change it to anything you want to. And then for each one of those, I'm just going to assign it to my little cache dictionary. So if I, and you'll notice this was a little bit of lazy coding. I put a little try catch here, but we can say the reason why is we'd have to check about 7 different things if we wanted to make sure this was clean. And we really just want to ignore rows that aren't being used, so I just do a try catch around it. A little bit of quick coding there, but it stays robust. So once I've got my load done, then I'm going to say, okay, let me check my GUID cache, which I now know has been loaded, and assuming that automatically load is turned on, and try and see if there's an entry in there for scope name. If not, create a new GUID, put it in that dictionary for later use, and if I'm automatically loading and storing, go ahead and save that file to store my GUIDs. Okay? And then the last thing is I'm going to return the GUID. And then that store GUIDs, what it does is just the reverse of load. We go through, we iterate over our GUID cache, we construct basically a big old string that has our cache in it, and then we ensure the directory exists for our target, and then we go ahead and write it. So really simple, 100 lines of code, and all this is configurable. So if I want to use a different file separator, and you'll see how we do this in just a second, I just say GUID manager.GUID file separator equals whatever, right? Just like I can specify the file path, and just like I could turn off automatic load and store. So how does this work in general? Well, if I open up this file here, GUID assignment.biml, let's go and just get the whole big thing here. There we go. So here's how you do it as a live script. We also have a transformer, which is cleaner. But if you're using BimlExpress, you don't have transformers. So here's the non-transformer way to do it. Basically, you put this on a really high tier. You reference that GUIDmanager.cs. And then just for convenience, I'm going to import the system.io namespace because we're going to do a little bit of path magic here to figure out where to put our template file. So what I'm going to do is say, well, GUIDmanager.GUID file path, right? So I have to tell it where to look for my file, is equal to path.combine, which just means put these two together with a backslash or whatever my system character for path separators happens to be. And then I'm going to say get the directory that my template file is in, which is just whatever this Biml file is. That's the path to it. So get the directory for that, and then in the same directory create a file called GUIDcache.txt. And that's where my cache is going to be. Then all I have to do, and remember this is the last step, for each task node in rootNode.allDefined successors of type task node, basically rootNode.allDefined successors says give me every single object in the entire project, and then actually just filter those to the task nodes, and then just say tasknode.id equals GUIDmanager.getID and pass it to task node. Pretty straightforward, right? So if I've got this code, then the only thing I need to do, and by the way, if you're interested in the transformer version, it looks like this, and it's cleaner for a variety of real-world usage scenarios, but I'll just show you briefly what it looks like. Here you would say, I want a target task. I'm going to configure the same GUID file path as before, and then I just say, hey, leave the task alone because it's local merge, except just change the ID to whatever that ought to be. So this is more of a procedural, and this one's more of a kind of like an aspect-oriented sort of approach. Now, if I jump back over here, let me go into the project that we created for Jim's example, and we're actually going to just go ahead and run that code here. So I am going to add in existing items, and I'm going to point this to I'm going to grab this code file, GUID manager, and then I'm also going to add in, technically you don't even need that one, but because you reference it from the code, but I like to have them in there. And then I'm also going to do GUID assignment.biml. And actually, I'm done, right? So I just need to make sure that in addition to running those two, I also run GUID assignment.biml and generate SSIS packages. Value cannot be null on path. I did something wrong. Let me check what it was again. Oh, it may have something to do with that. But let me just try running that again and see if that fixed it. I think the host isn't working here as well. We'll, as I said, I did this in BimlStudio. We'll patch this up, but just for demonstrating how this works in its entirety, let me just go ahead and grab this. I think the host.template file doesn't work the same way in this environment. There are a couple of little differences that you guys will notice in BimlStudio versus BimlExpress, and some of them will close the gap on over time, and some of them are unavoidable because the hosting model doesn't work the same way between an add-in and a standalone app. But most of them we can eliminate, and that wasn't actually it. I'll figure out what the issue is here, but it's some version of this unless someone can actually see what I'm doing wrong here. GUID file path. Yeah, I'll sort this out later and post it, but you guys can imagine what's going to happen here. And what your output is going to look like is something like the following. It will just be essentially and I'm just pulling it up on the other screen here. It'll just be a file called guidcache.txt, and then inside will be one row per task in your entire solution. And each of those rows will have a scope name followed by a comma, followed by a GUID. So I don't think I actually ran this, but that's what it'll look like. And this will be up on a BimlScript.com or similar post. So looking at the list here, Catherine asked, what C# does Biml support today? Many nice improvements in CS and C# 6 that I want to look into. So we are constrained by the version of the .NET framework that we can support. So in the past, we were limited to some of the C# 3.5 features, and that's because we wanted to, and actually what was holding us back there was some of the stuff in terms of how we integrated into Visual Studio for BIDS Helper. In BimlExpress, we have a new model that gives us a bit more flexibility, and we have more options in terms of framework versions that we can choose. But with that change, we were able to move up to .NET Framework 4.5, which is exciting for a whole bunch of reasons, including that we now get to use Roslyn for some of our back-end support. So there's a bunch of kind of code editing features that are going to open up to us now that we can use Roslyn, if you guys are familiar with that. Essentially, Roslyn allows you to it's basically compiler as a service, so that instead of these code nuggets being largely opaque to us, I mean, we can certainly see the code nuggets and we can do stuff with them, but without writing a whole bunch of code, we wouldn't be able to do stuff like refactoring on top of this, where I could say, hey, take this part and put it into a call Biml script and see which parts were inputs and turn those into parameters and do that all automatically. That's something that with Roslyn becomes not easy, but fairly straightforward. So that's all stuff that with 4.5 we're going to be able to take advantage of. C# 6 is going to be .NET Framework 5.0, unfortunately. Is 5.0 what they incremented it to? So we are going to have a little bit of a waiting game on that. While I know it's always interesting to try and pick up some of the new features, if we were to switch to .NET Framework 5.0, there would be a large number of people who could no longer use Biml, at least not with the 5.0 build, because their IT department, for example, hadn't approved installation of .NET Framework 5.0 yet. there's generally like a 2-year lag on that for the lion's share of everybody to have moved over. Now that being said, Catherine and others, if there's something really interesting in C#6 that would make the Biml coding experience a lot better, we could look into having, for example, multiple builds where we said, here's your Biml, .NET Framework 5.0 build, and here's the one for 4.5. But it would have to be fairly compelling in order to justify the confusion, the user confusion that would cause in terms of like, which one do I need? So another one, basic question in Bits Helper and BimlExpress, we can pick individual Biml files to generate SSIS. Can selection of individual Biml files also be done in BimlStudio? Yes. So if you go in here to BimlStudio, 2 thoughts on this. One of them is I can take anything from utilities and either convert it to live where it will auto-update with changes, or I can hit execute BimlScript and create flat Biml. The other thing is I can take anything here, like I'm going to just go, I'll actually show it to you. I'll add 2 packages, just like that. And then on any individual package, I can just right-click and say build and run, or build and open in bids. I can do that with multi-select too. So if I just do a straight build, you'll see that it has a build only flag that gets set, which says even though those other files are there because I might need them for metadata or for other reasons, only actually build the package 1 of type AST package node. And you'll see there it is. And if I go in here, and I can also say build and open in bids, and this is actually kind of a nice feature. At some point we've got to change that to SSDT. I really wish they hadn't. I really liked the name bids, but I guess they had good reasons for changing it, so we'll have to change ours to SSDT. On my other display here, it's opening up, and it's unresponsive right now just because it is spinning its gears, but there we go. So just package 1 opened. And that was Mark's question. Any other questions? I think I didn't miss any, did I? I think I caught all of them. Okay, well, that's right at the 3 o'clock time. So, yes, thank you also, Catherine. Thank you, everyone, for coming. We will go ahead and get this video encoded and put it online. We will announce its location, and we'll also go ahead and put the GUID cache solution online, and we'll also put the Project.params auto-generate, wipe it out and start over solution. I think we'll both put that in on Catherine's blog, and we'll also host it on BimlScript.com or someplace similar. So if anybody else has questions, we'll be doing another one of these in 2 weeks. And of course, if it's something pressing, you can reach out to me or others in the Biml community who have always been very generous with their time to get those questions answered also. So thanks again, everyone, for coming. Really appreciate it, and hopefully you found this useful. Again, if there's any feedback, you can send it directly to me. My email address is right there on the display someplace on your display. It's scott.curry@verigence.com. If you have any feedback feedback around things that you'd like to see done differently or additional or whatever, very, very eager to hear it. If this isn't working for you, let us know why, and we'll make some changes so that it works for you next time. Thanks again, and we'll see you soon.